Well, hi, welcome back to the podcast. We are joined today, I think we'll call it his sixth time here on the podcast, Jeff Leiker. He is Professor Emeritus from the University of Michigan, president of Leiker Lean Advisors, and author of the great books in the Toyota Way series and more. So, Jeff, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thanks, Mark.
great to see you again.
It was my pleasure.
You were guests episode 3. Episode 400, a bunch of episodes in between over the last 17 plus years. So thank you for coming on, Jeff. But today, as we're recording this, I want to congratulate you for something exciting that happened in your world yesterday. If you want to tell everybody what that was.
Well, Michigan is the national champions in football for the first time since 1997 when we were co-champions, and the first time, I think it was 1948 that we were sole champions. So it's a historic event. First time we've ever won 15 games in a row. I watched it with my wife last night, was completely delighted and still in the afterglow.
Well, I'm glad you have a voice, and congratulations to you and all the Michigan fans. I grew up a Michigan fan, growing up, not too far east of Ann Arbor, so it's not too hard to slip back into that mode. So very happy for you and everyone that I know back in Michigan. Except, not the Michigan State fans; they're not happy. But
no, we're Ohio State fans. Although I watched, they had this thing where they were showing the students in Chrysler Arena, the basketball arena, who are watching on a big screen. And in order to watch that YouTube video, you have to watch a public service announcement of how wonderful the state of Ohio is.
They try to convince people not to be too abusive.
I think no, it was just that they happened to be willing to pay for their spot on the YouTube thing. Okay. That was just ironic.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, yeah, that's just kind of like putting up a bill. That's the modern equivalent of putting up a billboard somewhere.
Right.
Gotcha. Well, so, okay, my mistake, but now I get what you're saying. We are going to talk about mistakes today and learning from them. And I'm glad it's not in the context of the Michigan Wolverines making too many mistakes on the field there in Houston yesterday, but bringing it back to Lean and Toyota. I want to pick your brain on this topic, Jeff. And maybe the first question is, from your study of Toyota, your experience with Toyota, how would you expect Toyota leaders to react when there's a mistake on the factory floor?
Okay, so first of all, when you talk about the factory floor, you'd have to ask what level of leader. Mm-hmm. So there's different levels. Sometimes Toyota will show the org chart upside down. Mm-hmm. So there's the team member who's doing the jobs, and then there's a team leader, and there's ideally one team leader for every 4 or 5 team members. Mm-hmm. And they're the first line of attack when there's an and-on pull. And then you go up from there. There's a group leader. The group leader is a first-line supervisor in the first level of real management. Then there's manager, and there's section manager, and there's general manager, and vice presidents and presidents. So it depends on what level you're talking about, because they will all react differently. But the first line of attack is at the team leader level. And the team leader is not a manager, mm-hmm. but rather is a worker. And they have been trained in leadership skills. They have leadership potential. And they specifically have been trained very deeply in problem solving. And they've done multiple projects to earn that place.
Yeah.
And one of their key responsibilities is to respond to the and-on, mm-hmm. which is when a team member worker notices a deviation from standard, their job is to pull the cord. And then that doesn't mean the line stops immediately, but the team member comes over and the team member has to decide, do I let the line keep going and then the line will stop when it reaches the next zone? Or do I pull the cord a second time, which overrides the line stop, and then the car will keep going? The team leader will pull the cord a second time if the team leader believes that he or she can fix the problem and contain it in process. And then at the end of the shift, and this is all recorded electronically. And at the end of the shift, the team leader looks at the andon pulls that day, and they'll be able to see quantitatively it happened on this station more than any others, and this was the problem. And then they're expected to do problem solving and address the problem. A general Toyota standard is if they can't solve the problem themselves within 5 days, on the 5th day, they escalate it to the group leader, who then deals with it. From the point of view of the group leader, when there's an andon pull, if the team leader can handle it. Now, if the team leader lets the line stop, then the group leader gets involved immediately. But if the team leader handles it, from the point of view of the group leader, either it's a non-issue because the team leader handled it, or it's a coaching opportunity. So they're constantly walking the floor, and if there's an andon call, they're going to watch the team leader in order to see how the team leader handles it and see if there's an opportunity to provide coaching. So Toyota talks about windows of opportunity for coaching. And one window of opportunity is when an andon is pulled.
And one
top, they're looking at generally overall numbers, like did we make the number of vehicles we were supposed to make within the regular 8-hour shift? What kind of quality problems we have? If there's a safety issue, that comes to their attention immediately, and they have to investigate. So they're looking more big picture, and they're supposed to be thinking about more general policy.
Yeah.
Like, is there some sort of recurring problem that we need to address from a policy point of view?
Right. To not be quickly responding to the same problem over and over and over again with a short-term countermeasure.
And there's different kinds of problems, different levels of problems. One kind of problem that's common is that the worker drops a nut or bolt. And that's not going to reach the president of Toyota in Japan, because it's happening every time, all the time, every place. But then there's another kind of problem where there's a serious injury, and then that's going to get the attention even in Japan. And there's another kind of problem where there's something called there's a quality audit done at the end of the line, and they're looking at that that the vehicle from the point of view of the customer, a finished vehicle from the point of view of the customer. They take a certain number of vehicles, and then in that case, if there was, say, several cases where the brake system was not installed properly, that would get the attention of the president.
Yeah.
And then they ask, why is that happening? And their job is, they use the term process confirmation. So they're trying to confirm if the correct process is being followed.
Right.
And if there's deviations from that process. I do a master class on lean leadership in cooperation with the Toyota plant in the United Kingdom. I've been doing it for about 8 years. I've been in the plant like 50 times. And they have developed a training room. They call it an Obeya, but it's a training room. And it lays out each of the roles, team member, team leader, group leader, et cetera. And it lays out their roles and responsibilities. And there's various teaching points. And at one point, they have a row of hats. And each hat has a different symbol on it. And one hat says, I'm a team member, and one hat says I'm a team leader, and depending on how many bars there are or something. So they have these all lined up, and then they show an arrow from the team leader to the team member, group leader to the team leader, manager to the group leader. And they say, don't skip hats. So if a team member were to pull a cord and a manager were to come down and say, why did you pull that cord, to the team member, that would be considered inappropriate. The manager should be asking the group leader. And one of the things the manager is trying to determine is whether the group leader knows and whether they have investigated enough to know.
Yeah.
But so the group leader uses that data to then coach the group leader.
Mhm.
But if the manager goes down to the floor and asks the worker what happened and why, can you explain it to me? Number one, they're usurping the authority of the team leader and group leader. Number two, they're not going to have the depth of understanding that the team leader has. So they're likely to start to jump to conclusions. And there may well be a reason why, based on past history and based on various conditions, why the team leader and group leader reacted the way they have.
Yeah.
And the manager won't understand that, and they may mess up things.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's a common issue when we're teaching other managers and other companies, is that they think the reason why you go to the Gemba is so that you can solve the problems.
Right.
As opposed to,
I'm sorry.
Oh, as opposed to just observe. You're right. A fly on the wall, and then you have to think and reflect on what should I do about this.
Yeah. So when you talk about don't skip a hat. I've seen or heard about situations where even a healthcare senior executive, I guess you trace back, they skipped a hat or two, and it ended up causing more trouble, or at least it wasn't following that path of what I hear you describing of the senior leader's job is to coach and mentor the person that had the role directly below them, not to circumvent them and jump in and be a hero.
Right. Yeah. So when we think of the chain of command, we think top down. We think the top is giving an order and then everybody's executing. But this is actually kind of a bottom-up chain of the command. It's not the top having the authority. It's the top having the respect of the people on the floor, to respect that they're trying to do a good job.
Yeah. And the responsibility to help.
Right.
Yeah. So, with all of the effort Toyota puts into mistake proofing, there are, I'm sure, inevitably errors that will occur, mistakes that we made, whether it's, physical slips. I dropped a part, tool slipped out of my hand, scratched the paint on the car. I don't know, I'm just making up examples, but the stories that I've heard from Toyota people, whether it's stories from the My Favorite Mistake podcast or stories I was able to include in The Mistakes That Make Us, the book, and there's other stories I've heard that I don't think I really have permission to put those stories in the book, but there's this common theme of individuals not being blamed for what was arguably a systemic problem.
Right.
I was wondering if you have examples.
Part of that comes from Dr. Deming, where he said, drive out fear.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, like 90% of problems are system problems.
Right.
And they're the responsibility of management. He was not saying 100%.
Sure.
So there's some, whatever it is, 10, 20, but some percent that really is somebody just wasn't paying attention and they messed up, or they didn't think of the rule at the time, or they were not paying attention when the standard work was explained or something. So, but he's saying that in the vast majority of cases, it's the system. So let's start with the assumption it's the system.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that then became kind of religion within Toyota. So they talk about the difference often between the 5 whys and the 5 whos.
Mm-hmm.
And the who is who's to blame.
Mm-hmm.
And the 5 whys is what allowed this to happen. And when you do the 5 whys, it's not unusual that anybody, any person, whether they work for Toyota or elsewhere, that their natural inclination is to blame the person. So they might say, so-and-so dropped the nut.
Mm-hmm.
Or so-and-so put on 5 nuts instead of 6.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could say, well, what are you going to do about it?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But in Toyota, they would say, why did that happen?
Right.
So they wouldn't say, don't blame the person, that's not our policy, and start reading the Riot Act. They would just simply say, all right, fine, that person dropped it. Why did they drop the part? And then let's say they said because they weren't paying attention and they didn't follow the standard work. Again, you don't need to argue with that person. What you need to say is, why didn't they follow the standard work?
Right.
And at some point, and I also have written about the idea of Kata in Mike Rother's work, and one of the things he talks about is a threshold of knowledge. And when you're at the point of a threshold of knowledge, you want to investigate. So at some point, you're going to detect that the person you're talking to is just guessing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why didn't he follow the standard work? I guess he wasn't paying attention when we did the training.
Right.
Okay, I guess. How could you find out?
Mm-hmm.
So now you're stopping the process and you want the person to go and observe, talk to people, investigate, and then come back to you so you can then do more coaching. So the 5 why is often thought of as a technical process to get to the root cause, when actually it can be a coaching process as well.
Yeah.
And also, you often assume that the first answer that's given is superficial.
Mm-hmm.
And by digging down, you're getting to the actual system that allowed this to happen. The other part of 5 why is that you want really to find not the root cause, but a controllable cause that will make an impact. So if you keep on asking 5 why enough, you'll get to things outside of your control, like it was product development's fault. And that's too far. So, you know, we know that we're not going to see a change in product development until the next new model introduction. So what can we work on right now?
Yeah. I've always joked, and maybe I heard somebody else make this comment, so I won't claim it was original thought, but passing along the idea of if you ask why too many times, you end up somehow blaming society or Congress, and you've gone too far.
Right. Or you could get into minerals, how their minerals are taken from the earth. Or you can go into evolution of how humans evolved and our genetic weaknesses.
Yeah. Somehow it was a damn meteor strike hundreds of millions.
Yeah, right.
But
so the point is, again, there's always more than one cause.
Right.
And there are some things we can control and there's some things that we can't.
Yeah.
But again, the process, what you're trying to do is to get the person to think and think beyond their first impression. And the first impression is often to cast blame.
Right. Yeah. And asking the 5 whys with a blaming mindset wouldn't get us anywhere, right? Like,
no.
Jim Bob dropped the part. Why? Because Jim Bob's clumsy.
Exactly.
Why? Because Jim Bob doesn't care. Why? Because I'm like, no. That's
right. That's another issue, is that you could go down that wrong path. And so then there's another tool that is used very commonly in Japan is the fishbone diagram, or the cause and effect diagram. And again, that's another way to get the person to think beyond placing blame. So there's the person, machine, method, materials. So there's going to be some things related to the person, like Bob is clumsy. And then off that, you can say, why is Bob clumsy? His hands are just too big. Or, you can have different. But then what you do is you say, let's investigate to see the relative impact of these different causes. At some point, you're going to say, what can we focus on that we have some control over?
Right.
And then if the person says, well, Bob's too clumsy, and then you might say, well, is that something we can change? Can we change Bob?
No.
And in some companies, they'd say, sure, we can fire Bob. Well, is that really what you want to do?
No.
Is there something you'd rather do first before you assume that we need to fire Bob? And then we have a bunch of causes there. Pick something from that list. So the fact that you have a brainstorm, you have a wide set, gives you the ability to kind of steer the person toward the system.
Right. Yeah, because if we are respecting our team members, not just for their backs and their hands, but also for their brains, you wouldn't want to fire why would you waste the investment that you've made in training Bob to be a good team member? I mean, it could be if Bob's hands are too big, maybe there's just a matter of job fit.
Right. Or
Where
it could be a matter of why is this job designed so that only people with small hands can do it?
right, right, right. Yeah, because I mean, if a part's always being dropped, there's a grip. Could be a design issue related to the
Right.
part itself, or to the types of gloves they're wearing, or what have you. But I mean, it seems like that mindset. And maybe I can frame this question thinking about times when you're trying to help other companies. It seems like that blame habit is so embedded that it can be a really hard habit to break. Like your co-author for a few of your books, David Meyer, who's a friend of mine and told stories for the podcast and in the book, talked about a mistake he made, but then he also, talked about the mistake of being too quick to blame and how he had to unlearn a lot when he came into Toyota because that wasn't his first job.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but what are your thoughts on trying to unlearn those old habits?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the Kata for a second, but in doing the research, it took about 5 or 6 years for Mike to develop the model of the improvement kata, and realize that really what he needed to focus on is creating the mindset of scientific thinking. And the mindset of scientific thinking would cause you to then question your assumptions, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he learned along the way, he studied cognitive psychology and how people learn, and he's also studied neuroscience, which gives you some insights into how people learned. And one of the things he discovered is that we don't unlearn something. That the habit is deeply embedded, and you may go to your grave with it, with those neural pathways. What you can do is you can overwrite a new set of pathways that your brain is more used to. So that to the extent that you practice a new habit repeatedly, like say, for example, I'm right-handed and I can't do anything with my left hand, but I want to get good at using my left hand. I mean, I wouldn't do this or wouldn't recommend this, but a good thing to do might be to tie your right hand behind your back so you can't use it.
Sure.
And then you're forced to use your left hand in practice. And over time, you'll develop the neural pathways. And then when you finally untie your right hand, you might find you're doing things with your left hand that you used to do with your right hand because your neural pathways are so well developed. Now that's in that example, I think that the right-handedness is so genetically wired
Right.
that most likely you would very quickly want to start using your right hand again.
Right.
So you'd have both. You'd be ambidextrous, which is what, for example, a basketball player wants to be. But if you have the neural pathways that you've built up to react with anger and blame when something goes wrong, you're not going to erase that. You might have gotten it from your father when you were a kid. And that's deeply embedded. And one thing we know about learning habits is that every time you do something a certain way, you're more likely to do it that way again. You keep on reinforcing that habit. So as long as that's the way you're dealing with problems, you will keep doing that. As well as there's also a concept called confirmation bias, which is the bias where we tend to want to select information data that confirms what we already believe.
Yeah.
So you will find a way to convince yourself that you are right and to yell. And that's the only way you can deal with these people because they won't listen to reason. So how do you overcome that? And somehow you have to practice an alternative. So I have to somehow get you in a situation where your tendency is that you want to blame and yell, and instead you ask a question. And then after you have that interaction, then we talk about it.
Right.
And then you agree, that worked better. And
I'm sorry, I'm smiling. I'm thinking about some of these leaders I worked with 30 years ago at GM that had very deeply embedded habits, and I'm just thinking of I'm sorry, I'm just playing out a scenario where you tell one of them, okay, well, instead of yelling, you need to ask questions. And the first question would be, what the bleep is wrong with you?
Yeah, right, right,
Like, okay.
right,
So,
right. Yeah, no, there's a few problems there. One of which is that the boss who is doing the coaching also has that bad habit. So they went to a class and somebody told them to ask that question, and you know that they're full of it.
Yeah.
And the second problem is that you don't want to, as soon as I say, you should, when you go to the floor, please ask questions instead of yelling at people, I'm entering through the rational cognitive mind. I'm assuming that the person is in control of their behavior and emotions. And if I either order you or convince you through logic and you agree, you can now change your behavior. But the definition of a habit is that we do it without thinking.
Right.
We don't decide to do it that way. It's just that we have the neural pathways embedded, and it just happens automatically.
Yeah.
So what I have to do is to get you to do something interesting or useful or is important, and then find these, what Toyota calls these windows of opportunity for coaching. So what Mike Rother does with Toyota Kata is he says, let's teach kind of a problem-solving approach, which is to understand your direction and understand your current state, and then set short-term goals, and then run experiments. So now I'm not going to you and saying, hey, by the way, you should be asking questions. I'm going to you and say, we've been learning this new approach to helping you achieve your goal. Are you willing to try it? And then you agree on an important goal, and then you try to understand the current condition, and then you start to run experiments. Now, if in the course of that, like for example, in the current condition, they say the problem is, so in order to reach their goal, the workers have to follow standard work. And then they say, the problem is that workers don't want to follow standard work. They want to do it their own way. Well, now you have an opportunity for coaching by saying, for example, what you're describing really is an obstacle. Let's put this on what Mike calls the obstacle parking lot.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that at some point. But first, we have to actually figure out what we want to standardize. We don't want to standardize a bad process, so let's work on the process. And it may well be that by the time you actually start to work on the real issues and you're talking to the worker, the resistance against standard work doesn't even come up.
Right.
But if it does come up, now that's an obstacle. And then you'd say, well, what are some things we can try to overcome that obstacle? So you're trying to get them to think about that not as a innate characteristic of people that we can't change, but rather as an obstacle to our goal.
Right.
And you're doing this day by day by day. So over the course of several months, you have lots of opportunities to train the person so that they think differently about problems.
Yeah.
And you never have to really give them lectures about why it's important to ask questions and why it's important to blame the system and not the person. You don't have to get into any of that.
Yeah. So when we think about trying to transfer lean methods, TPS methods into other companies, it seems like the mechanics of things are far easier to copy, if you will, or transfer than the mindset. So if we bring a system that works well in one culture, it can crash and burn in another. And one example I'm thinking of, is the andon cord. And I remember an article, and I'm pretty sure this was only 15 years ago, an article about a new Ford truck plant that had installed all the same andon cord technology that you would see in a Toyota plant. And this article, it was actually from the BBC, but I don't think it was about a UK Ford plant, but the BBC article said, the andon cord was only pulled a few times a week at the Ford plant.
Yeah, right.
And I'm thinking like, oh, that must have been somebody testing to see that it worked.
Right.
For whatever reason.
Right.
How do we help a company get past that problem and do so in a way where they're not blaming the workers for not pulling the andon cord?
Okay, so I guess one of the things we have to do is to accept our limits. Think about our own situation, our own role vis-a-vis the company, and what resources we have at our disposal, and what kind of power and influence we have. So if I were to be, say, hired as a consultant to Ford, who said, we have this problem and we want to change it, and we've got X number of plants. Last I knew, they had something like 130, 140 plants, and in every plant there's bunches of managers at different levels. How do we change their way of thinking so that they encourage the andon and don't punish people when they pull the andon?
Right.
And to some degree, from my point of view as a consultant, if I'm being honest, that's going to be an impossible task. I mean, I can convince, say, this vice president who brought me in about certain things, like the Mike Ruther's idea that these are habits, and you really have to get down to the level of changing behavior and changing mindset, and it starts with you, and all that. And there's to a certain degree, having, particularly in a hierarchical culture like Ford has, having a vice president who's modeling, who's speaking, who's persuading, is going to have a certain amount of power, of influence, at least to make people aware that there seems to be new messages coming from the top, that we need to be nicer to our workers and encourage them to point out errors. But to really do it, if you go back to Mike Ruther's Kata, what you'd like to do is, and this is the way Toyota works with outside companies. They have a group in America called the Toyota Production System Support Center, TSSC, and they would say, let's go to one of your plants and let's do a model line project. And let's work with one supervisor and that supervisor's area of control and their manager up to the plant manager. And we'll do the project, and as we do the project, we'll be teaching problem solving, and we'll have opportunities to coach. And then once we have that one chain learning, and that would typically take about 8 or 9 months, then we can figure out what's next, how others can learn from that, and how many more plants we can take on. And we refer to that as going an inch deep and a mile wide.
Right.
I mean, I'm sorry. An inch wide and a mile deep. That's my mistake.
We all make mistakes. Right.
So an inch deep and a mile wide would be more like, well, you as the vice president have to tell them that they need to pull the andon more. And let's go plant by plant and visit and meet with the plant management, and let's develop a presentation you can give. So now we're trying to scatter like fairy dust across all these different plants, the pronouncement from the vice president that this is the new way. And then we're going to do a 3-hour course on andon and how to use it. Which we know doesn't change behavior. It can change awareness, it can change what people say, but it's not going to change their actual behavior. So you could do superficial stuff that's 1 inch deep and a mile wide, or you can do something deep that actually changes habits that's 1 inch wide and a mile deep. When you go deep, you're not going to go wide, so you're not going to quickly affect a lot of different plants and a lot of different leaders. But at least you build the kernel to then grow organically and to then bring people to other plants and to cross-pollinate and then also begin to develop coaches and also begin to learn what it takes in this culture of Ford to change behavior. So you now have an informed answer to the question of what should we do next, instead of just guesses. So that's what I would do. Now, if I were to, and I've been in this position many times where I've been asked to bid on a request for bid, an RFP, request for proposal.
Right.
So I'll talk to somebody who will contact me and say, we have this new initiatives and this is really important to our company. And Jeff, we read the Toyota Way and we want you. But we also have a committee of people who are going to look at proposals, and we need you to write a proposal. We'll help you with it. We want you to win, but we have to go through this process if it's okay with you. And about, I don't know how many times, 5, 10 times, I've gotten suckered into it. And what they're looking for is a very organized roadmap with key milestones and how long it's going to take and what is going to be our return on investment.
Right.
Often their final question is, are you willing to put some of your fees at risk based on the outcomes? And I say, none of that's going to work. We don't really know until we get started. It's going to be a process of discovery. So I can tell you how I'm going to get started, and I can give you a general overview, philosophy. And anyway, I've never won one of those. Not once.
Somebody is willing to put out that plan, even if they don't know.
Lots of every other consulting company they approached put out that plan. But I wouldn't do it.
Right.
So it's clear that so the first question is, do they really want help? Are they serious about it, or do they want to just act as though they're addressing the problem?
Or would you have been a good fit for them, and vice versa? That
would be the right thing to do is to ask, are they a good customer for me? And am I a good fit for them? And unfortunately, in most cases, I think the answer is no. So I know, for example, Mike's attitude is, if you think about all the organizations in the world, if 5% of them are a good fit, that's still way more than you can handle.
I did look, that BBC article, I'll put a link in the show notes, was 2007, which I find that interesting, because I'd like to think Ford would have had those things figured out by 2000.
What was that? What did it say? Was it in Louisville?
I'm going to open up that article quickly. The BBC link has changed. Okay. So it's on my blog. I'm trying to see if it said which Ford plant as I scroll through. I might have to go find. I'm sure that article is probably still out there. No, it says, okay, here we go. The link has probably changed to the BBC site, so I'll fix that. But it says, Ford's brand new truck plant in Dearborn, Michigan pulled the Ford only twice a week.
All right.
A legacy of generation.
I'll give you a little background on that plant. At some point, we had a conference when they first opened that plant, and they had put a lot of effort into developing the culture from the start. And we were running at that time an annual lean conference, and it was John Shook and Mike Rother and I through University of Michigan. And that year we had, the year they opened the plant, we had the plant manager come to speak, and he had his team, and they had worked with some former Toyota people for like a couple of years.
Sure.
And one of the things that they were told by the Toyota people was that you really need well-trained group leaders, and you need a team leader role. And the team leader is, again, it's a worker who's been trained in problem solving and given extra leadership training, and they've actually proven themselves. You pick them from the workforce based on them proving themselves, and then they are offline. Now in the Toyota plant, the normal ratio, a typical ratio would be you have a group leader, you have 4 team leaders, and then you have maybe 20 to 25 people. So each team leader might have 4 or 5 or 6 people. So the group leader has 4 team leaders. On a given day, 2 of them are working on the line and 2 of them are working offline responding to andon, and they keep on rotating. So you're actually paying for only 2 people to be offline, even though you have 4 team leaders. So I say you get 2 for the price of 1. Anyway, at that point, in that plant, they had decided to include a team leader role, which is critical for the andon, for responding to the andon. And also the team leader is one of us. If I'm a worker, it's John who works next to me, and I've known John for years. And John, I respect John. John's a leader. So John is the one who's encouraging me to pull the cord, and John is the one who's responding. So they spent a lot of time, and they brought the group leader and team leader on board months earlier than normal so they could train them. Well, in the meantime, you've got Ford Finance, and Ford Finance say, explain to me again why we're paying for these extra people.
Right.
And they ended up, and it turned out at Kentucky Truck, where they were also making the same F-Series trucks, they did not have team leaders. And they said, we're going to compare the Dearborn output, quality issues, productivity. We're going to compare that to Kentucky Truck. And if the team leader role is truly as valuable as you say it is, this plant ought to perform better.
Yeah.
If not, we're going to kill the team leader idea. So
Yikes.
They couldn't do anything about it. So that was what's going to happen. So then something on the order of weeks, I don't know if it was 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, but weeks. And meantime, because they were speaking at the conference, I was out there visiting. They were taking me on tours, and I was interviewing them sort of to get background and helping them to put together their presentation. And they had a nice presentation, but then weeks before they're going to launch the plant, and actually we were doing a tour in the plant as part of the course, as part of the conference. Now I remember. I talked to the guy who's in charge, and he says, we're screwed. And I said, what happened? He said, well, there were layoffs in the Rouge, and they have a system called bumping and bidding, where somebody more senior can bid on a job. And if they're more senior, they bump you out of the job.
Right.
So what had happened is that they had downsized one of the plants in the Rouge, and it was one local. And hundreds of people from these other plants bumped the people they had trained.
Right.
And now they're launching with a whole new set of people. They had spent like 8-10 months developing culture, training people. They had developed the standard work. They did everything that the Toyota people told them to do. But the people they trained were gone.
Wow.
And then before you know it, the plant manager was gone. And the head of that site was gone because this launch did not go well. What a surprise. And it turns out Kentucky performed better, so the lesson learned was the team leader role doesn't work. So that was it's really sad. So it's not surprising that they never. So if that hadn't happened, and if senior management Ford was truly interested in learning and encouraging them to experiment with the team leader role, it would have been a totally different story, I think.
Well, it's really fascinating to hear, the some of the history there. I mean, what the BBC wrote was probably true, but not fully complete. So
I would say that what they wrote was superficial and uninformed.
So
they're less generous than you. I wouldn't say that they're lying. I would just say that they don't know what they're talking about.
So again, like their causal analysis, it didn't go very deep. So
exactly.
They only pulled the cord twice.
Didn't ask why more than one time.
I mean, the legacy of generations of mistrust between shop floor workers and managers seems like a true statement, but not really the answer.
That's true. So what happened in the plant is they were trying to intervene. The managers, leaders, and the Toyota people were trying to intervene in the culture, but because of that bumping and bidding system, the historic natural culture of Ford won.
Yeah.
So if the BBC were saying that they couldn't overcome the legacy of all that, that's true. It's true that they were not able to do that.
Yeah.
Why? What could have happened if, and why that happened is something that you probably didn't get out of the article.
No. But that's where somebody might say, in that case, or pointed at some other organization, they tried lean and lean failed. They're like, well, lean ran up against the company's finance culture, the union contract.
Right.
It led,
Right.
There's these
But I'm convinced that with the effort that was made by all those leaders and what they had learned and their belief system, I'm convinced it would have worked.
Mm-hmm.
And it would have been more like a Toyota plant than a traditional Ford plant.
Yeah.
I can't prove that, but that's what I believe is true.
Yeah. So maybe one last topic here, Jeff, to touch on one of the things I've had a chance, I wish I'd learned about it sooner, but in recent years have had a chance to learn more about what people call psychological safety, the feeling of safety to speak up. And I think pulling the andon cord is an example of speaking up. And I went back through your books and back in Toyota Culture, that you and Mike Roseas wrote. That's the only direct mention I could find of the phrase psychological safety, where it says, quoting from the book, Toyota believes people must be treated fairly. They must feel psychologically and physically safe. And without trust in their employers, employees are reluctant to admit to the existence of problems and learn that it's safest to hide them. So I'd be curious. I'll try to make this as open-ended a question as possible. Your thoughts on, this quote unquote psychological safety and how big of a factor that is when companies are trying to embrace lean.
Well, I was thinking about why that was the case. Certainly, I think the reason it was in that book is because I was writing with Mike Roseas, who was the human resource manager at the Georgetown, Kentucky plant. And Mike is a very, very sensitive person, and he's very concerned about things like psychological safety and people's emotions and all that. Mm-hmm. In Japan, they don't worry about that. They don't talk about that. They talk about getting the job done. They talk about problem solving. So they will often quote Taiichi Ohno, who says, "No problem is a problem." Mm-hmm. So what he was saying is that if you tell me you don't have any problem, you're just unaware of the problems you have, because I know you have problems, because there's always problems. So you'll hear that, which is sort of a bravado statement, but you wouldn't hear Ohno say, "I'm concerned that people don't feel psychologically safe to admit they have problems."
Sure.
So in Western culture, there's a different vocabulary used in Toyota plants compared to in Japan. Whereas in Western culture, they will talk about emotional intelligence, and they even have courses on emotional intelligence for managers, and they will talk about psychological safety. So partly it's that distinction that made me more aware when I was working with Mike. But also, I think it's, to some degree, it's true that it's so natural in the Toyota plant for people to accept and understand that they have to pull the andon, they have to be willing to admit mistakes. It's so foundational because the whole system is based on problem solving, continuous improvement, which it dies if we don't think we have anything to improve.
Right.
And what do we have to improve? Our problems. And the problem is defined in Toyota as a gap between what should be happening and what is happening.
Right.
What is the standard? What is the goal? What is the policy? What's the standard for the product? And what's actually happening? So the reason you go to the Gemba is to be able to see reality and see the gaps with the target, see the gaps with the standard. If you don't see a gap, if you don't understand that there's a gap, then you can't improve anything.
Right.
So it's so foundational, they can't even imagine
Sure.
how you could have an environment where people, but on the other hand, I remember it might have been in the Toyota Culture book that I had interviewed Fujio Cho, who
Mm-hmm.
was the first president of the Georgetown, Kentucky plant. And I asked him, what was your biggest surprise when you came to America and were trying to introduce TPS in America? And he said, my biggest surprise is that uh, people were afraid to pull the end on.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, what did you do about it? He said, I had to go to the shop floor every day and encourage people. It's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Pull the cord.
Yeah.
You won't get in trouble. So he felt that he had to be at the Gemba to personally encourage people.
Yeah.
And that was his approach, his answer. And then we have a story where Mike Hoseas goes to a meeting with Fujio Cho, his like annual review, and he has pages of scores on KPIs and data, and there's green and red and yellow, and he has all the green items on the front
Mm-hmm.
of his report, and all the red items are at the back. And as he's talking, Fujio Cho takes the paper out of his hand and he
Right.
starts looking through it.
Yeah.
And Mike like pulls the paper back from him, and
Yeah.
he resorts it.
Yeah.
And Mr. Cho says, Mike son, it's okay. I'm looking for the red because you're a good manager, and I know there's a lot of green, and I know that you're doing a good job, and I don't need to help you with the green items. But I can help you with the red items. I need to understand what you need from me.
Right.
And Mike said that he like walked out of there like he felt like he had been on another planet.
Yeah.
Because his previous employers were so different.
Right.
That he was just unimaginable. But that one meeting made it. And I say that just one meeting and talking to people doesn't make much of an impact. That one meeting made a huge impact on Mike.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the Georgetown plant. It was just over a year ago. I had a chance to go and do the public tour. I've done the San Antonio plant many a times. I've seen the plants in Japan. I just never gotten to Georgetown. Now that I live closer, it's easier to get there. So during the tour, they talked about the andon cord, of course. And then afterwards, in the visitor area, there was one of the people on the tour was a Toyota retiree who had brought like children and grandchildren to be part of the tour.
Huh.
And he was talking and ended up sharing. I think the Toyota people had already walked away. I think he was there when the factory launched or ramped up.
Right.
And he was talking about, they talk about andon, and that was great at first, but then when the Americans started running things, that started changing, and we started getting pressure to not stop the line.
Yeah.
And I just think about the evolution and the challenges to really make that culture stick.
Right. Yeah. So everybody. So David Meyer was one of the first. The people that first started there. They knew their number. I'm employee 76. Forever that's ingrained in their head. So when they first launched, they brought an army of people from Japan. Mm-hmm. So if you were a group leader, you had a trainer. If you were a vice president, you had an executive coordinator. The executive coordinator might be on a 3 to 5 year assignment, and the trainers might be there as long as they can get a visa. So maybe they're there for 6 months or a year, and then they rotate. But continually, you have some Japanese guy whose job is to teach you the Toyota way.
Yeah.
And that was like at a peak of learning and socializing them in the Toyota way. Then eventually those people had to go back to Japan. It was several years, but eventually those people had to go back to Japan. And then another thing happened, which was that also coincided with interest in the Toyota production system being probably at a peak, particularly in the auto industry. And everybody wanted to hire a Ford group leader or manager, and you could double your salary overnight. So not only did they lose the Japanese, they were also losing these managers who had been trained by the Japanese. and that took a dip. And I mentioned in the United Kingdom, they have that Obeya for training, and they actually have a chart that shows from when they launched till today, and they're showing the ups and downs of the Toda culture over that time. And there was a big dip. Then they put a lot of effort, and they brought back some Japanese. They put a lot of effort into retraining, and then they started going up again. And then events happened, like when the Great Recession happened. They offered buyouts to managers, and then when business came back, they hired outside people, and then things went down again. So it's been those ups and downs.
Yeah.
So partly somebody like you talked to, it depends on when they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Because there were ups and downs, and during an up period, they were probably doing pretty well. And it also depends. Depends on their frame of reference, their standard. So their standard was way up here.
Yeah.
And then if, say, the average plant was here and Toyota's up here, they might have come down like this.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it was a big drop from what they're used to.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's hard to kind of judge what that means. But there certainly are managers who they'll say they know there's trouble when the manager is more interested in the score on the KPI than the process used to achieve the KPI.
Right.
And when they get to that point, they say all they care about are the numbers, that that there's trouble.
Right.
But then that usually leads to, within 6 months, within a year, you'll see that there's a new plant manager. Sometimes it's a Japanese plant manager. And then they're trying to recover the culture. Yeah. And that's, it's going up and down over time. Yeah. So it takes constant effort.
Yeah. I've heard of different waves of, getting back to basics with standardized work.
Right.
And, I guess
and suddenly it's like rediscovered 5S like they never heard of it before, and that'll become a campaign for a year.
That's surprising to hear, but I guess it goes to show the laws of entropy in a corporate setting.
Right. Yeah. So that's a constant effort. In the case of the UK plant, that's why they developed the Obeya. That's why they created those clear roles and responsibilities. That's why they instituted more training for the team leaders and the group leaders and managers. And they're at a point now where they're at a pretty high point, a pretty positive point. But it could go, and there's a lot of uniformity in the basic thinking and beliefs of the senior managers. That doesn't change much.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, thank you for being a guest again. Last time we were talking about the second edition of the Toyota Way, so I'll remind people about that. They can still get that, and in addition to the great back catalog of other books, Toyota Culture. When I think of Dave Meyer, the Toyota Way Field Book was his, co-authored with you.
Right. And Toyota Talent was with Dave
Toyota
Meyer.
Talent. That was his other one. So,
any other recent books? One of them is a comic book. It's called Engaging the Team at Zingerman's Mail Order. And Zingerman's Mail Order is a mail order company that sells fancy, expensive foods. And they ship them around the country from Ann Arbor, Michigan. And one of my PhD students started working with them about 15 years ago. And we've been working with them for the last 5 years or so on Kata. And this is a 60-page comic book that tells the story of how they have been using Kata to engage the frontline worker. So that's new. That's only a few months out.
Yes. I feel like I should have interviewed you and talked more about that book, but thank you for...
It's always possible.
Okay. Well, maybe we can. Not let another 4 years go by, I hope. I know you're continuing to work and you're writing. Last time we talked about guitar. Are you writing guitar music or just playing?
No. Well, I play classical guitar, and classical guitar is very rigid. It's like standard work, and the standard work was written by somebody else who lived 200 years ago, and they were brilliant, and they wrote, and you want to play this music the way they wrote it, so you don't improvise on classical guitar.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Jeff, thank you again, and certainly wish you all the best here for 2024. Thanks for joining us.
Take
Thanks.
care then.